were quolls and possums, wallaroos and bandicoots, and sugar gliders too. Yes, marsupials are our subject today. Some need our protection, while others have a poisonous pal who protects them from the predators that we've introduced. We take a look at kangaroos out in the wild, and at the little roos who are heading there. And where else could we possibly begin but down under?
The world's largest and most varied collection of marsupials are found in Australia. The roos are the most recognizable, but there are more than 100 marsupial species here. When the continental plate, which we now call Australia, began to float away from the others, it carried with it a variety of landscapes, from rocky hills to open plains, and also a group of primitive mammals that have spread out to fill every niche, the marsupials. And it's the pouch in which the females raise their young that distinguishes them from all others. While the mother drinks, the baby quenches his thirst too, snug in the pouch, or marsupium as it's called. But this is the later stage of a remarkable series of events that began almost a year ago. After a gestation period of only a month, a joey was born, a baby kangaroo so underdeveloped it's only the size of a honeybee. It then makes a grueling journey, swimming through its mother's fur, until it finds a nipple in the pouch, where it clings on for dear life. A fetus that has to fend for itself. But that's the marsupial way. And there are many other such pocket mammals. Millions of years ago, it was possible to walk through the Americas, Antarctica, and straight on to Australia. It was one vast landmass. Most marsupials ended up in Oz, but it's thought that the first ones, like these opossums, evolved in South America. And the list of marsupials has a positively poetic ring to it. Possums and bandicoots, koalas and quolls.
And here in the Dryandra Forest in southwestern Australia, the dainty little numbat. In the early 1960s, Western Australia chose the numbat as their emblem, only to discover a few years later that it was nearly extinct. A moment of embarrassment that's prompted it to pay more attention to this termite-eating marsupial, also called the banded anteater. An individual will eat about 20,000 termites a day. But it, in turn, is preyed upon by foxes. And it's fox control that's brought the numbats back from the brink. Having made sure that this area of the forest is fox-free, the Department of Conservation and Land Management are, for the first time, able to watch the numbat population growing. They're now being monitored on a regular basis, and what fascinating little creatures they are. This mother was found in the hollow trunk of a tree. After careful transportation back to base, this numbat is first measured and all her biometric details are recorded.
7.6.
Then, so that she can be identified and later on tracked through the forest, measurements are taken for a radio collar. It must fit perfectly and not hamper her.
Yeah. Alright, let's do that again.
The way a numbat raises her young is rather remarkable. These tiny 6-week-old babies were born after a pregnancy of just 14 days. With the numbat, there's no pouch, and the youngsters clamp themselves onto their mother's teats with their mouths. They don't have much protection, just the hairs on her belly. She's then returned to the same hollow tree where she was found. It's now several months later, and, armed with tracking equipment, a couple of scientists return to find out how she's getting along. There she is. But what's happened to the 4 embryonic babies that she was suckling? They too are healthy, close to independence and searching for termites, like their mother. There are no foxes here, but that doesn't mean there are no predators. The mother's keen eyesight and hearing alert her. This carpet python is not quick enough to catch a numbat. It finds a hollow tree trunk which numbats visit, it can tell this by the smell, and then waits inside for its meal to be delivered to it. The other youngsters are still out foraging for termites, but Mother is already arranging things. Carrying her most dependent offspring on her back, she makes her way to another sleeping nest, and one by one, the rest of the family follow her. She regularly has to find new sleeping places to keep one jump ahead of her predators. She's carried one babe there, the other 2 have to come by themselves. But what's happened to the last, who strayed near the python log? This time, it too ends up safely inside the tree trunk, and not inside the hungry python. When some plastic kangaroos were used at the Atlanta Games to promote the next Olympics in Sydney, there were complaints that they didn't represent the city's cultural sophistication. The next question was, well, what is the symbol of Australia? No one could think of any alternatives, so the kangaroo it is.
One of the many odd things about kangaroos is that on land, they can only move their hind feet together. But if they're swimming, they can move them independently. And this fellow might look as if he's in full purposeful flight. But it seems that the typical flight response of a red kangaroo is to bound off for a short distance, stop and reconnoiter, and then bound back towards its adversary and hop right over it. They live in feeding groups called mobs, and maybe that's a good name for them. There doesn't seem to be a particular leader. They all move independently. The males take no interest in the young and don't protect them or the females. The only thing that really gets them going is another male who wants to take over their harem. These youngsters are just practicing. But these are the kickboxers of the marsupial world. Two boomers, mature males, fighting for a female. No holds barred. There are 47 different species of kangaroo, and they live in all sorts of locations. At home in rocky outcrops are rock wallabies, with thick padded feet that resemble the radial tires on cars. But this roo is only halfway to being a wallaby and is known as a wallaroo. These tree kangaroos live on leaves and fruit. And this is the smallest of the family, the rat kangaroo, the only one that doesn't hop. For 125 years, this species was thought to be extinct, until one was found alive in a bird trap. It's the Gilbert's potteroo. 100 years before the British explorer Captain Cook set foot on the mainland in the middle of the 18th century, Dutch sailors, who called the place New Holland, landed on this island off Western Australia and found it overrun by small rat-like animals the size of domestic cats. They called it Rottnest, or Rat's Nest Island. And what they mistook for rats were actually the very first Australian marsupials ever seen by Europeans. They're quokkas, a kind of small wallaby. The larger kangaroos survived the arrival of European settlers. But the introduction of cattle and sheep, not to mention the dreaded fox and cat, spelt disaster for the smaller mainland marsupials. But that sad story had a much happier ending on Australia's outlying islands, where alien predators were fortunately kept out. And so today, the quokkas living here are probably the only ones that Western Australians are familiar with. And they've become the celebrities of Rottnest Island. Do you know why kangaroos are called kangaroos? Well, it all began when a European settler saw one hopping past and asked a nearby Aborigine what it was. The Aborigine replied, "Kangaroo," which means, "I don't know what you're saying, mate." A story now of a poison that became a protector, an enemy that became a friend. And it begins in the Perup Forest in southwestern Australia.
Nighttime in this natural forest, undisturbed for millennia and still available as a habitat for small marsupials such as quolls and bettongs. But in the 1970s, Per Christiansen, a young forest officer, discovered their numbers were in rapid decline. It was easy to understand why this would happen if the land was cleared and their habitat destroyed. But why should it happen here, where everything they need for survival is still abundant? After studying pockets of survivors, Per Christiansen put forward the theory that it all came down to foxes and rabbits. They were both introduced from Europe in the 19th century. The rabbits thrived so mightily that the foxes soon had little effect on their numbers, which soared into the millions. Not so the indigenous marsupials, who bred much more slowly. And this is where the poison comes in, another part of the puzzle. At about the same time, it was realised that in some parts of Australia, the smaller marsupials were surviving. And these were the places where you found Gastrolobium, a poisonous member of the pea family. Early settlers couldn't understand why in some places their livestock died soon after arrival. It's now known that they must have eaten the Gastrolobium, of which there are about 40 species. The toxic parts of the plant are its flowers, seeds, and growing tips, and they're not only lethal to cattle and sheep, they're deadly to rabbits too. And if foxes eat the dead rabbits, then they too get poisoned. Crucially though, the plants are not toxic to indigenous animals. Over thousands of years, they've evolved a tolerance to its poison. Like this emu, which feeds on the Gastrolobium without any problem at all. The final part of the puzzle, which would make the Gastrolobium the saviour of the marsupials, was the discovery that the toxin in its seed pods and flowers was the same as a poison called 1080. This was already being commercially produced to control the rabbit, which had become a pest. So once it was known that 1080 didn't harm marsupials but did kill their predators, the Department of Conservation and Land Management could begin fox baiting. Firstly, by burying eggs laced with the poison. .1080 poisoned meat could also be dropped from the air. So the Gastrolobium that developed its defences to protect itself against the local browsers now protects them against the predators that came from over the seas. The battle is not yet won. Foxes haven't been eliminated, only reduced in number, and the result still hangs in the balance. But thanks to Per Christiansen, these mini marsupials have at least got a sporting chance, all because of the Gastrolobium. The fleshy green outgrowth on the Gastrolobium seeds is intriguing. It acts as a bribe to ants, which carry the seeds away to their underground nests. There, the seeds await the annual bushfires, the heat from which stimulates them to germinate. In nature, one thing leads to the next, to the next, to the next. Which leads us onto our final story, Fauna Rescue, or take a roo with you wherever you go.
It's a bit embarrassing at the supermarket checkout when they say, "What's in that bag, ma'am?" But Bridget Pittman is used to that. And so is Bonnie, an 8.5-month-old kangaroo orphan who stays with her 24 hours a day. Bridget is one of Fauna Rescue's devoted volunteers. And she not only has Bonnie in the bag, but out in the back garden there are 2 other roos that have lost their mothers. Clyde and Brewster are a bit older than Bonnie. Brewster, who's closest to us, is almost ready to move on to the next stage of his rehabilitation. They're both accustomed to being out of the pouch, or shoulder bag in this case, but they're still very attached to Bridget.
here. Look at here. No.
And when it's feeding time, it's back into the kitchen. If the joey is very small and furless, it has to be fed every 2 to 3 hours, even in the night, which means some very bleary-eyed carers. But these two take more conveniently timed meals.
Come on, Brewster.
Bridget prepares a milk replacement for her joeys. Even though they're already eating some grass, at this stage in the wild, they'd still be suckling in their mother's pouch. Kangaroos are lactose intolerant, which means they can't digest cow's milk, and so have to be fed a special formula. And it has to be heated to just the right temperature, exactly like a human baby's bottle.
Come on, boys. Just drip water all over them. Come on, fellas. Come on, fellas.
Close as they are to one another, Bridget knows that Brewster's time in her garden is drawing to an end. After recuperation comes the main aim of fauna rescue: release into the wild.
Listen, boys. Boys. He's got his ears up.
Brewster is 15 months old, Clyde 11 months. Although at this age they're different colours, they're both western red kangaroos. And soon, grass will form the bulk of their diet.
Come on. Oh, he's a good boy.
When Brewster was younger, he had a major setback when he slipped on the kitchen floor and broke his leg. He had to be in plaster for 3 weeks, and he needed physio for a further 6. But he's recovered well, and the next step in his life story is about to begin.
Okay, go over if you can. Need to swap lanes in a sickness. I don't know the names of these roads. I mean, I've lived up here all my life. It's like, oh, yeah.
This is the end of suburbia for Brewster. There are wild kangaroos out here, and he'll gradually be introduced to them on another private property, which has a much larger enclosure. The wild kangaroos often approach the fence around the enclosure and check out who's inside. Brewster will be able to get used to them, and of course to the other orphaned youngsters who are awaiting release.
Oh, that's not good. No, it's getting better.
Bridget looks anxiously at him, and Brewster anxiously surveys his new companions. It's a difficult time for both of them. Bridget has to give up her babe, and Brewster has to begin to genuinely fend for himself. When Bridget finally leaves, and Brewster realizes what's going on, it's a bit like a toddler's first day at school. Hey, Mum, why are you leaving me here? Brewster, who'll soon get used to his new home and his new friends, will stay here for about a further 10 months. Then, when he's 2 years old, it's the wide open spaces for him. There, hopefully, he'll be accepted by the wild roos that came sniffing round the enclosure and spend the rest of his days in a mob of his own. Yes, from a world of fences to a world of freedom.